Hello friends, this is Jim Das Selvas bringing you the first test done with the Advanced Squad Leader Starter Kit 4. This starter kit concerns the Pacific Theater of Operations, where Japanese, American, Commonwealth and Chinese armies clashed in the Far East during World War II. After a highly successful campaign during the second part of 1941, which culminated in the attack on Pearl Harbor when they reached the pinnacle of their conquests and their power, they had already conquered, or were in the process of conquering Mongolia, parts of China, Korea, Indochina, Burma, Indonesia, the Philippines, part of New Guinea, islands in US territory in the North Pacific and a series of island colonies in the South Pacific, forming an outer defensive perimeter at a safe distance from the central Japanese islands, threatening the lines of communication between the United States and Australia and New Zealand. From that moment on, with its army and its powerful navy extremely extended in its activities, and after the setback suffered in Midway in June 1942 when they lost a large part of their aircraft carrier force with the destruction of the AKG Soryu, Kaga and Hiryu, a spiral of failures takes place. With this event, the Allies take the strategic initiative and start to attack the outer limits of the Japanese defenses in intense and savage battles, with an enormous cost in lives for both. This scenario, called Kawaguchi's Gamble, portrays one of these first battles during the Battle for Guadalcanal, more specifically on 13 September 1942, where a mixed battalion composed of Raiders and Paramarines of the United States Marine Corps, under the command of Colonel Merrit Edson, were ordered to occupy a quiet area, a ridge with line of sight over the important airfield called Henderson Airfield. Both the Raiders and the Paramarines were depleted due to previous battles, mainly the Paramarines with the very difficult battle to conquer the islands of Gavutu-Tanambogo, and were in this area considered safe for rest and reorganization. The Japanese, however, were not inactive and were already preparing to retake the areas lost until now and eventually retake the important Henderson Airfield, key to maintaining control of Guadalcanal. With this background, we will present the forces involved in this struggle. Japanese elements of the 1st Battalion of the 124th Regiment and units of the 2nd Battalion of the 4th Regiment will enter the first round from the south. These units will consist of 13 first-line units, which have the stealth property that adds advantages -1 modifier during possible ambushes. At this point, let's open a parenthesis to address some of the special characteristics of Japanese forces. The first and fundamental one is the fact that the Japanese units, in general, do not have their morale break when they suffer a successful attack, other than kill in action KIA, they just suffer a reduction in their numbers, which is characterized by the red stripe on the back side of the counters, and remain in good order. If they suffer a second successful attack, they have their numbers reduced again to half squad, remaining in good order and can continue with their activities normally. Only on the third attack do they have their morale broken under a DN counter. In other words, these units are extremely resilient, at the cost of progressive erosion of their war capacity with a reduction in personnel and firepower. Japanese leaders also do not have their morale broken when subjected to a successful attack, and are transformed into a wounded leader, with their morale and modifier reduced to a lower level, being able to continue with their activities and use their modifier normally, with the exception from having its movement reduced to 3 movement factors. These leaders add +1 morale to troops in the same hex. The problem is that every time a leader is injured, he must undergo a wound severity test, with the roll of 1 die to assess the severity of the injury. If the result of the dice is 5 or 6, this leader will be eliminated, with a 33% probability of this happening, which is high. Finally, another important feature of these units is the ability to perform the so-called banzai charge, which have some similarities with the human wave of the Soviets, as we could see in the episodes of Streets of Stalingrad. The key difference is that just one Japanese unit in good order with line of sight on an enemy unit up to 8 hexes away, provided it is accompanied by a good order leader, can declare this attack. These banzai units have their morale increased by +1. If in the same hex with a leader they will have +1 added as well, are immune to the pin test check, have their movement potential increased to 8 movement factors, and can enter an occupied hex by the enemy in the movement phase. Certainly during this battle we will be able to observe a gigantic banzai charge in greater detail. Japanese forces will still have 2 medium machine guns, and their operators 3 light machine guns, and leaders 8 to 0, 9-1 and 10-1. Americans. The American forces will be composed of 4 squadrons of 558 Raiders, with excellent morale and normally with a stealth ability with the -1 modifier advantage during the ambush. In addition, 4 squadrons of Paramarines, characterized by the parachute symbol in the middle right corner of the figures in the marker, also 558. They will also have a 37mm anti-aircraft cannon, with a high rate of fire greater than or equal to 3 when throwing the red die, the operators of this cannon, 2 medium machine guns, and leaders 9-2 and 10-2. Forces will be the first to set up their disposition on the map, north of, including the D column. American forces will have an exceptional experience level rate, ELR, of 5, while the Japanese ELR will be 3. Win conditions. The Japanese will win at the end of the game if there are no American units, non-leaders, in good order in any level 1 hex. Scenario Special Rules, SSR. 1. Pacific Theater of Operations terrain will be in effect. 2. Once per game, after the first turn, the Japanese will be able to roll 1 die during the beginning of the Japanese movement phase. If the result is lesser than the turn number, each of the American units hidden in good order, and that are not in the same hex as a leader in good order, will suffer a normal morale check, which if not passed will suffer a loss of concealment. 3. Once per game, after turn 2, the Americans will be able to roll 1 die in the Japanese rally phase. If the result is less than the phase number, any Japanese unit stacked with the leader 10-1 will not be able to perform actions during this turn, with the exception of routing or attacking defending during close combat. During each rally phase of the selected turn, broken units stacked with the Japanese leader 10-1 automatically recover their morale. 4. The Japanese win if, at the end of the game, there are equal or less than 1 American unit in good order in level 1 hexes, as long as the anti-aircraft gun has been captured or eliminated. 5. American leaders in good order will be considered as stealth for purposes of ambush determination, -1 modifier. Before starting the actual match, some considerations related to the terrain involved in Pacific theater operations need to be made. Forests, woods, are considered dense, providing a plus to protection against direct fire, require the use of 2 movement factors when moving through these areas, are inherent, that is, the edge of the dense woods follows the edges of the hex that it occupies, affecting the shots that pass in these margins. Forests also impose a stacking limit equivalent to 2 squads, plus up to 4 leaders. Units occupying adjacent hexes represented by dense forest, pune or bamboo cannot form fire groups to attack an enemy. Setup. The Americans will be the first to make the setup on the board and must be positioned north or on road D. The idea here is to arrange these units in order to occupy positions with good cover, in this case the woods with a terrain modifier of +2. In addition, whenever possible, the Americans should be positioned on elevations in the terrain, which adds an extra difficulty for hostile units to reach them. For example, if a Japanese unit, unaccompanied by a leader, tries to attack an American position in dense forest on an elevation, total of 4 movement factors, it will become CX, and with this, they will be greatly harmed during the ambush, where they will receive a +1 modifier, and during close combat, where all units involved in this action will receive a +1 modifier on their attack, even if only one of them is CXCD. Finally, the units will be positioned with the greatest possible line of sight over open ground on the possible avenues of advance of the Japanese forces, to obtain the maximum possible number of modifiers on the hostile units with the intention of reducing their strength to the maximum, both numerical as well as in quality, mainly in the cases of banzai charge, and to be able to enter close combat with the greatest numerical and qualitative advantage possible. In this way, most of our firepower will be placed in the west area, with the medium machine guns, the anti-tank gun which will have an excellent line of sight over hexes of open terrain practically from the entire G column towards the east, as well as the entire southern and west fronts. These units will be under the command of the leader 10-2. All American units will receive the concealment counter. Towards the east, some scouts will be positioned in advanced positions with squadrons on the level 1 elevation at the edge of the hill in that sector to hinder the advance of Japanese units that may venture into that sector. Further to the rear, a squadron, accompanied by the leader 9-2, will be positioned at the rear, providing a region for safe withdrawal for the rout and rally. Now let's do the disposal of the Japanese forces. Observing the disposition of the hostile forces, the Japanese chose to distribute their forces into main axis, one on the right flank to the east and another axis on the left flank to the west. Kawaguchi, the 10-1 leader, associated with squads made up of stacks that respect the limit of 2 squads per hex, in order to be able to enter the dense jungle areas, will move along this flank with the intention of heading to the elevation limit on that area. The leader 9-1 will also be moved to this sector of advancement. For the west flank, the weakest leader, 8-0, will be stacked with the units carrying the support weapons, the 3 light machine guns and the 2 heavy machine guns, all respecting the 2 squad stacking limits to get into the hex's dense jungle. The exception will be squads that will take the jungle path in the C5, D4 hexes, which allows for a 3-squad stack. The idea in this sector is to be able to form a base of fire at the edge of the jungle in front of the open terrain to, in this protected position, attack the American defensive positions positioned there, removing, if possible, the concealment marker of these enemy units. Well done, friends. After all this work and organization, we are ready to start this 6.5 round battle of the S-64 scenario, Kawaguchi's Gamble, and our first adventure in the field of Starter Kit 4. With that, Jim says goodbye. Namaste. Hello my friends, let's start this battle, starting with the first turn of the Japanese phase. Since there are no actions in the rally phase and prep fire phase, we move straight into the movement phase. Let's start on the right flank, where the far right stack becomes exhausted, CX, and moves quickly, 6 hexes, toward the north. As this stack moves outside of enemy units' line of sight, it does not lose the concealment counter. Stack with leader 9-1 moves 5 hexes to hex E10. To finalize movement on this avenue of Japanese advance, stack with leader 10-1 becomes exhausted, CX, and 8 movement factors are used to move to hex D9, also out of line of sight of enemy units. On the left flank, the 3-squad stack 4-4-7 moves using 4 movement factors for hex C5. This unit can maintain a stack of 3 squadrons since these units move along a pathway in the middle of the forest, which also reduces the movement factor cost from 4, without a pathway, to 2 using the pathway. The stack next to the 8-0 leader moves using the 6 movement factors it is entitled to, for hex D6. As a last Japanese move, stack with 2 squads 4-4-7 move using 4 movement factors to reach hex C6. With this, we ended the Japanese movement phase, where all Japanese units moved outside the line of sight of enemy units and, with this, maintained their concealment counters. The presence of these counters brings advantages such as hiding the units stacked under them from the enemy's view, in addition to reducing by half the firepower of the shots fired on the units under this protection. There are no actions in the defensive fire phase, as American units have no line of sight to Japanese units, and there are no actions in the advancing fire phase for the same reasons. No actions in the rout phase and move on to the advance phase, where Japanese forces will be able to advance for 1 hex in any direction. Stack on C5 advances to D4. Stack at C6 advances to D5 using all its movement factors, which are 4, to enter dense forest, to movement factors, and overcome the terrain elevation, to more movement factors, and with this, if becomes exhausted, under the CX counter. Finally, stack with the 8 to 0 leader moves from D6 to E6, and as it is entitled to 6 movement factors, it is not exhausted. The stack under the exhaustion counter, CX, moves from D9 to E9. This unit, despite ending its movement in hex adjacent to the enemy unit, does not lose its concealment counter for moving with assault movement in concealed terrain. Stack with leader 9-1 moves from E10 to F9. The last stack to move advances to G10, and here Jim makes a mistake, as he advances with 3 squads into the dense forest, whose stack limit is only 2 squads. Jim will certainly fix this flaw in due course. With this, we end the advance phase, and as there are no actions in close combat, we will end the Japanese phase of this first turn, stopping for the American rally phase of turn 1. There are no actions in the American rally phase, and we move on to the prep fire phase where the American forces will be the attackers. Stack with the leader 10-2 gives up the concealment counter and opens fire on the Japanese units on D4 with 6 firepower due to the enemy being protected by the concealment counter. The modifiers will be +2 for the forest and -2 for the American leader. '8, which in the 6 firepower column is a pin test check. With the Japanese units losing concealment and the American machine gun not maintaining rate of fire. Much to the dismay of the Americans, no Japanese squad is pinged. Another American stack relinquishes the concealment counter and fires at units under the CX counter on D5 with 6 firepower with +2 modifier through the dense jungle. Before shooting, the line of sight between the units, which exists, is checked. +5 + 2 equals 7, which is a normal morale check, with the stack losing the concealment counter and the US machine gun losing rate of fire. The first squad becomes pinned, and the second squad takes a casualty reduction, flipping the counter to the face with the red stripe. The Americans choose not to fire again, and we move on to the movement phase. The American stacks adjacent to the Japanese units on the edge of the hill move to the rear, maintaining concealment, and go to the jungle edges in H7 and H6 while the 9-2 leader goes to the I6 hex. Defense fire phase. And the Japanese stack on D4 will massively fire on the American units under the concealment counter in the G3 hex, using the inherent firepower of these squads and light machine guns. Here Jim made a small mistake against the Japanese, as the aggregated firepower of these units would be 12 FP inherent to squads and 6 firepower to machine guns, in a total of 18 firepower, which does not exist in the infantry firing table, with the firing being analyzed in column 16. With this, one of the Japanese machine guns would not be needed in the firing and would not be predisposed to break with a result on the dice greater than or equal to 11. And the worst happens, with the result on the dice of 12, the shot is a miss, and the machine guns break. Here again, Jim makes yet another mistake against the Japanese, by confusing the full advanced squad leader rules with those of the starter kit. In full ASL the machine guns would break, however in the starter kit a random selection must be made to identify one of the machine guns to become non-functional. The Japanese choose not to make any attacks. And let's move on to the advancing fire phase, where there is no action, passing through the rout phase and ending with the advance phase. This takes place without actions, and as there is no close combat, let's move on to the rally phase of the Japanese phase of the second round, which promises many emotions. Alright friends, with that we end this first turn, and we are going to the second turn, where the Japanese forces will certainly position themselves to launch a banzai charge to eliminate the American units. See you soon. Namaste. Hello my friends, welcome back to this intense battle that took place in September 1942 for control of the strategic Henderson Airfield airstrip. The Japanese forces have advanced towards the American units, and are preparing to launch their attack. Let's fight. As the first important measure in this rally phase, the Japanese will try to restore the functioning of their light machine guns that jammed in the previous phase. Only one of the machine guns is recovered. End of the rally phase, and we go to the prep fire phase. The stack consisting of the 3447 squads will get one shot at the American units in the G3 hex with 12 firepower reduced to 6 due to the American units being under a concealment counter and a +2 modifier from the dense jungle. With a result of 5 + 2 = 7, which is a normal morale check. The concealment marker is removed. The squad passes, but, unfortunately, the cannon operators have their morale broken. Movement phase. CX markers are removed and units to the east move towards the Americans. The two-squad stack shifts from G10 to I9 heading toward the rear of US troops. The other two squads move from F10 to H9. Defensive fire phase. Stack with the leader 10-2 fires at Japanese units carrying the light machine guns, with 12 firepower, with the modifiers +2 for dense jungle and -2 for the leader. With a result of 10 we have a pin test check, and the machine gun loses its rate of fire. The first squad passes, the second squad is erroneously pinned, and the third squad passes. The other American stack with the medium machine gun will fire on the same Japanese units, with 12 firepower and a +2 modifier through the dense jungle. Seven +2 equals 9, which is a normal morale check, and the US machine gun loses rate of fire. The first squad passes. The second breaks, and they face the side with the stripe. The third squad breaks above the ELR, which is 4 for the Japanese, and has its quality reduced and its face turned to the side with the sash. Finally, the squad on top of the anti-aircraft gun fires a 4 firepower +2 through the dense jungle, which is a miss. Advancing fire phase. Stack on D5 fires the American guys on H3 with 2 firepower +2 through dense jungle. Which is a miss. The Japanese stack, under the 8-0 leader, reflects whether to fire the medium machine guns, with 4 firepower, -2 through dense forest, against the American units in G2. After pondering, Jim resolves to keep these units under the protection of the concealment marker. Route phase. The cannon team takes advantage of the path in the forest and will position itself next to the leader 9-2, spending the 6 movement factors it is entitled to. Advance phase. Stack on E6 shifts to F5. Units from D5 go to E6. To the east, stack with leader 10-1 moves from F9 to G9. Stack with the other leader at E9 moving to F8. Close combat phase. There is no action. Rally phase of the American phase of the second round. The Americans try to restore the unit's morale under the DN marker, with modifiers of -1 for the jungle, -2 for the leader, and +4 for the DN marker. The American unit is not restored to morale, and the DN marker is withdrawn. The American unit takes over the operation of the anti-aircraft gun. In the full ASL, if a unit other than the specialized teams suffers a burden in relation to the possibility of breakage and the rate of fire, which does not occur in the starter kit. The Japanese managed to restore function to one of the broken light machine guns. Prep fire phase. The American stack under the leader 10-2 takes a shot at the Japanese on D5 with 12 firepower, +2 for the jungle, -2 for the leader. Six, which is a 2 morale check, the machine gun loses its rate of fire. The first squadron breaks and is face up. And the second squadron breaks again, has its strength reduced to half squad. American stacking on H3 fires on units under counter F5 with 6 firepower +2 through the jungle. Nine +2 equals 11, which is a loss. Finally, the anti-aircraft gun fires on the Japanese units with 8 firepower using the so-called infantry fire equivalent, IFE, where it is not necessary to go through the process of hitting the target, with the reduction of the rate of fire by 1 point. This 8 firepower will be reduced to 4 due to the advance phase, +2 for the jungle. Seven +2 equals 9, which is a miss in the 4 firepower column, which causes the Japanese to maintain the concealment counter and the cannon loses its rate of fire. Stacking on H7 thinks about giving up the concealment marker and shooting with 8 firepower, reduced to 4 firepower by the Japanese stacking concealment marker on G9 +2 for the dense jungle. However, after a brief reflection, Jim decides not to fire this shot, which is strange to say the least, because if the reason is to keep the concealment marker, it could be retrieved if the American units headed into the jungle, away from the view of the Japanese, in the advance phase, recovering the concealment marker in the close combat phase. Anyway, movement phase. Units in H6 move to I5. The units in H7 advance to H6 where they are attacked by the Japanese units in F5 who give up the concealment marker and fire 8 firepower from the medium machine guns, halved by the American concealment marker plus 2 by the jungle. Seven plus 2 equals 9, which is a miss, and machine guns lose rate of fire. And here Jim makes a mistake against the Americans, not considering the Americans' concealment counter using 8 firepower, and the shot causes a pin test check, causing the Americans to lose the concealment counter. American squads pass this pin test check. Defensive fire phase. The Japanese on D5 shoot the Americans on H3 with 8 firepower plus 2 for the jungle. Which is a miss. Stack on E6 shoots the Americans on G3 with 6 firepower plus 2 through the jungle. Double 2 causes Japanese units to cover, and your shot will be analyzed in the column immediately to the left of the 6 firepower column, which is 4 firepower. Four plus 2 equals 6, which is a normal moral check in the 4 firepower column, and the American squad passes. The Japanese squad in D4 shoots the Americans in G3 with 2 firepower plus 2 through the jungle. Which is a miss. The Japanese in G9 give up their concealment and fire with 4 firepower against the Americans in G3 plus 2 for the jungle, -1 for the Japanese leader. Five plus 1 equals 6, which is a normal morale check that Americans overcome. Advancing fire phase. The Americans in H6 fire on the Japanese in F5 with 8 firepower, as the American units have the assault fire property, and in the advance phase, their firepower is halved to 2.5 firepower, which are rounded up, and 1 firepower is added, which results in a firepower of 4 for each US squad involved in this fire. The modifier will be +2 for the jungle. Four plus 2 equals 6, which is 1 moral check. The Japanese leader passes. The first squad also passes, as the Japanese leader adds a point to the morale of the Japanese units in the same hex, but again Jim misses and considers this squad as broken. The second squad passes. Rout phase. No actions take place. Advance phase. I5 to H4. One squad on I6 moves to H5 while the other one moves to the 9- to leader. The squad under the anti-aircraft gun moves to H3. Units in G2 leave for G3. Close combat. And the American units under the 9- to leader, out of sight of the Japanese forces, recover the concealment counter. With this last move, we find the Japanese forces arrayed in such a way that they can unleash at least 2 of the dreaded banzai charges on the Americans. At this moment we close this episode, and I hope to see you soon. Namaste. Hello friends, welcome back to this series where Jim tinkers with the mechanics of starter kit number 4 that covers the Pacific Theater of Operations in the Advanced Squad Leader game. We are entering the Japanese rally phase of the third round, where the Nippon forces are about to drop the dreaded banzai charge on the Americans. The banzai charge allows Japanese units involved in this type of attack to head towards enemy units with several advantages. The morale of units involved in the banzai attack is increased by 1 point. These units are immune to pin or heat of battle, and also gain a total of 8 movement factors. The units involved in banzai only cease their activity if they enter the hex on which the charge was directed. If the units enter hex with an enemy unit, with the end of the 8 movement factors, or have their morale broken or are eliminated by fire of the enemy. But before we get there, let's start with the rally phase of the Japanese phase. The Japanese try to recover the function of the light machine gun in D4, which in addition to not recovering the function, they have this machine gun eliminated due to the result of 6 on the dice roll. No more Japanese activity, and the Americans will try to recover the morale of the gun crew who are stacking up with the 9-2 leader. The modifiers will be -1 for the jungle and -2 for the leader, and this unit will have its morale restored if the dice result is less than or equal to 11. Three minus 3 equals 0, and the unit regains its morale. The American squadron in G3 will attempt to equip the cannon, requiring a 5 or less dice result. 5 and the squad takes control of the cannon. Prep fire phase, and the Japanese choose not to shoot, retaining their potential to be used in the banzai charge. Movement phase. And finally, we come to the long-awaited moment of this match, which will be the launch of the banzai attack. During this attack, Japanese units move towards the hex target through so-called impulse. The impulse ends when all units involved in the banzai move 1 hex, using in this impulse the number of movement factors equivalent to the highest spent movement factor. This may not seem clear at the moment, but during an action itself we will be able to appreciate this dynamic in greater detail. The units involved must move towards the objective hex, in the sense of always being closer and closer to this objective hex. For the banzai attack to be launched, we need at least one of the units involved to have a line of sight on the target hex unit, and that this unit is 8 hexes or less from the enemy unit. The presence of at least one leader is necessary. For this charge, Japanese units in hexes F8, G9, H9 will be used. Jim chooses not to use the units in the I9 hex, as his movement towards the banzai target, which will be the hex occupied by the anti-aircraft gun in G3, will cost 4 movement factors in the first impulse. This unit moves to the American rear at J7. The central axis of this charge will be the units with the leader 9-1 in G9, whose final target will be the G3 hex, 6 hexes away. As previously mentioned, these units have an increase of 1 morale point, are immune to pin, can enter enemy hex in the movement phase, with no possibility of ambush, and lose the concealment marker. The axis of this movement will be around line G. Leader 10-1 will not participate in banzai. First impulse, G9 to G8 using 1 move factor. Units in F8 move to F7 using 2 movement factors due to jungle, and units in H9 move to H8 using 2 movement factors due to moving up 1 level. With this first impulse ends using 2 movement factors of the 8 it is entitled to, and now the Americans can carry out the defensive fire. The Americans use infantry fire equivalent, IFE, from the anti-aircraft gun on the Japanese units in the G8 hex, with 8 firepower, without the help of the leader 10-2. As modifiers we will have -1 for the open terrain of the hex where the Japanese units are located, and -1 for not using the assault move. With the result of 4-4, the American unit suffers covering, and the column of 6 firepower will be used in the evaluation of this shot, and the cannon loses the rate of fire. 8 minus 2 equals 6, which is 1 morale check. The Japanese leader passes with ease. The second and third squads also pass. The American squadron in this hex fires using the medium machine gun, with 8 firepower directed by leader 10-2, with the modifiers of -1 for non-assault movement, -1 for movement in open terrain and -2 for the American leader. 7 minus 4 equals 3, which is an casualty reduction and 2 morale check, with the machine gun maintaining rate of fire. The first roll of the dice will be for the random selection of the unit that will suffer the casualty reduction. The leader is chosen, and this leader is wounded, and has his quality and modifier reduced. Jim, once again, drops the ball and fails to do a dice roll to assess the severity of the injury. With the result of 8 plus 2 equals 10, and first squad suffers a reduction in effective, turning this marker face to that with the strike. With the result of 6 plus 2 equals 8, and the second squad passes, as this unit has a morale of 9, 7 plus 1 for Banzai, plus 1 for the presence of a leader in the same hex. Only now does Jim decide to assess the severity of the Japanese leader's injury, and with a result of 4, the leader passes. The Americans fire a new shot, with 6 firepower, -4 modifiers. Double 5 to 10 minus 4 equals 6, which is 1 morale check. There is no covering as the shot is directed by the American leader. The machine gun loses its rate of fire. The Japanese leader passes as his morale is increased by 1 point due to Banzai. The first squad also passes. And the second squadron is reduced in strength, and the counter is flipped to the strike phase. There is no more defensive fire, and we go for the second impulse. F7 to G7 spending 1 movement factor. G8 to F7 spending 2 movement factors due the jungle, and H8 to H7 spending 2 movement factors, spending a total of 4 movement factors in 2 impulses from 8 to that these units have. Third impulse, H7 to H6 with 2 movement factors, G7 to G6 with 1 movement factor. and F7 to G7 by 1 movement factor, spending 6 movement factors so far. The wounded leader does not follow the stacking because after the wound, he has only 3 movement factors that have already been exhausted. The American stack on I6 shoots the Japanese stack on H6 with 7 firepower, doubled to 14 firepower by being point-blank fire. The modifiers will be -1 for non-assault movement, +2 for dense jungle, -2 for leader -2. The shot will be 12 firepower -1. Four -1 equals 3, which in the 12 firepower column equals a reduction in the effective and 3 morale check, K/3, which Jim considers just a 3 morale check. The first squadron breaks above the ELR, and with the result of 12 they must suffer a casualty reduction and a quality reduction, so we will have the 447 squadron reduced to a second-class 347 squadron that takes the phase with the strike. The second squad breaks, and its face is turned to the face with the strike. The Americans choose not to fire any more shots. In the case of the Americans on I6, they will be obliged, in the case of the Japanese units advancing on this hex, to fire a fire shot tripled by the shot originating from the same hex, and if they have already used the subsequent first fire, this fire will be a final protective fire, when the result of this mandatory shot will serve as a morale test for the American units, and if they break, they will enter close combat in very unfavorable conditions, under the DN counter. In the case of the Americans in H5, they choose not to fire to keep the concealment counter, which guarantees the advantage of being attacked by half the enemy's firepower during close combat. Let's go to the fourth impulse. The Japanese units on H6 move into the hex occupied by the American units on I6 using 2 movement factors. Units in G6 move into the hex occupied by Americans in H5 using 2 movement factors. Finally, the stack in G7 moves to G6 at the expense of 1 move factor. With this we end this banzai attack, with 2 Japanese stacks penetrating hexes occupied by the Americans, and the last squad ceases the banzai charge for having exhausted the movement factors. Jim will mark the hexes occupied by Americans and Japanese with the close combat counter just to demarcate them, because, technically, they will only start close combat from the advance phase. It is important to note that, in the case of penetration of a hex occupied by enemy units in banzai charge, an ambush does not occur. The Americans on I6 will fire a shot at the Japanese units that penetrated the hex with 7 firepower, ALD 3.5 FP, for being subsequent first fire, tripled by the fact that the shot originates from the same hex. Firepower will be 8 firepower, +2 for dense jungle, -1 for non-assault movement, -2 for leader, -2. 8 -1 equals 7, which is 1 morale check. With the result of 8, the first squadron should be pinned. They are no longer under banzai, as they have the 1 point increase in morale maintained until the end of the Japanese phase, but Jim considered the squadron as being affected and reduced to half squad. The second squad also breaks and becomes a half squad. At this point, Jim checks the rules for starter kit number 4 and discovers that, in the case of Banzai, both units that penetrate the hex and those that occupy the hex lose the concealment counter, and Jim has lost the opportunity to perform a first defensive shot against Japanese units that were in adjacent hex, and will only perform a first defensive fire on Japanese units, crippled by the shot originating from the same hex. This shot will be 10 firepower, crippled to 30. The modifiers are +2 for dense jungle, -1 for non-assault movement. Eight plus 1 equals 9, which is a 2 moral check in the 30 firepower column. The first squad takes a reduction and flips to the face with the stripe. And the second squad passes, ending activities related to this Banzai charge. Now let's move on to the second Banzai charge. The units located in hexes F5, E6, D5, and D4 will participate in this maneuver. The target will be the American stack on H3. Let's start the first push with D4 moving to E4 with 1 move factor. D5 to D4 with 2 movement factors. E6 to E5 with 1 movement factor. F5 to G5 with 1 movement factor. With this movement we end the first impulse of this Banzai with the expenditure of 2 movement factors. From now on the Americans will be able to unleash their defensive fire. And they do it with the lone American squad in H4 with 8 firepower -1 for the Japanese open ground, -1 for the non-assault move. Eight -2 equals 6, which is 1 morale check. Eight plus 1 equal 9, which is the same morale as the Japanese leader who has his morale increased by 1 due to Banzai. Under usual conditions, when the result of the dices in the morale check equals the morale of the unit, it becomes pinned, which does not occur in Banzai charge, where units are immune to the pin. The other units pass this morale test check. The Americans choose not to direct any shots, and we go for the second impulse. The newly attacked stack penetrates the American hex in H4 with the expenditure of 2 movement factors, ending its participation in this Banzai. The American squad in H4 generating a shot of 5 firepower halved for being a subsequent first fire, crippled to 7.5 firepower, with a shot of 6 firepower, -1 for non-assault movement, +2 for the dense jungle. Nine plus 1 equal 10, which is a miss, and we will move for third impulse. The squad at E4 moves to E3 at the expense of 1 movement factor. The E5 squad moves to F4 at the expense of 1 movement factor. And finally, the squad from D4 to E4 with the expenditure of 1 movement factor, with the expenditure of a total of 4 movement factors so far. The Americans fire an illegal shot with machine gun at H3 on the Japanese squad at F3. This attack is illegal, as the dense jungle is an inherent obstacle to the hex, that is, the edges of the hexes with this type of vegetation are also dense jungle, which is an obstacle to the line of sight that passes through this margin, which is the case here. Either way, the shot will be 4 firepower with the modifiers of -1 for open ground movement, -1 for non-assault movement. 5 minus 2 equals 3, which is to moral check. Nine plus 2 equals 11, and this Japanese squad becomes a half squad. Let's go to the third impulse. Units in F4 move to G4 at the expense of 1 movement factor. The half squad in F3 moves to G4 at the expense of 1 movement factor. Units in E4 move to F3 at the expense of 1 movement factor, ending the third impulse at the total expenditure of 5 movement factors. Japanese units in F3 suffer the 2 residual fire attack, -2 modifiers. Five minus 2 equals 3, which is 1 morale check. The first squad breaks above the ELR of the Japanese, and therefore will suffer a reduction in manpower and quality, becoming a second-class 137 half squad. The half squad suffers the third morale break and becomes broken under the DN marker. The 2 American units in H3 fire a total of 20 firepower on the Japanese in G4 with -2 modifier. Seven minus 2 equals 5, which is an excellent 4 morale check. The first squad surprisingly passes. The second squad breaks and becomes a half squad. And, in a new stroke of luck, the half squad passes the moral check. Fourth impulse. Units in G4 move and penetrate the hex with American units in F3. The Huff squad in F3 moves to Hex G3 occupied by the Americans. In H3 the Americans do a 12 firepower attack. -1 for the non-assault move and +2 for the dense jungle. 4 + 1 = 5, which is to moral check. 11 + 2 = 13, and the Japanese squad breaks above ELR and will be reduced in quality and effective, becoming a second-rate to 3-7 squad. The Huff squad breaks above the ELR and finds itself reduced to second class. As it is the third sequential break, it is under the Diane marker. The 237 Huff squad passes the test. Units stacked under the leader 10-2 fires on the Japanese Huff squad. 12 firepower, -1 for non-assault movement, -2 for leader, +2 for jungle. With the result of 2, the Japanese Huff squad is eliminated. With that we end this second banzai attack. There are no actions in the movement phase, and we move on to the advancing fire phase, where the Japanese units will be able to shoot on the American units. In H3 the 2 Japanese units will fire a shot of 4 firepower halved for being advancing fire phase, crippled by the shot originating in the same hex, with 6 firepower, +2 modifiers for dense jungle. Before the shot, let's clean up the board a little by removing the residual fire and defensive fire markers. Ten +2 = 12, which is a miss. Hex H4 firing 12 firepower from the machine guns +2 through the jungle. Six +2 = 8, which is 1 morale check. Eight +1 = 9, which would be a breach of American morale, which Jim does not consider. H5 8 firepower +2 for jungle. 2 +2 = 4, which is 1 morale check. The first squadron breaks with the result of 8 +2. with the same result. The second squad also breaks, which will give a big advantage for the enemy on close combat. The next attack will be on I-8 with 6 firepower plus 2 for jungle, which is a miss. The Japanese units in G6 could fire on the hexes where the opposing forces exist without hitting the friendly units, as these units are not yet in close combat, but Jim does not use this resource. Rout phase. F3 to D5. Advance phase. Units in G6 can advance over the adjacent hex, but do not, preferring to advance to G5. The Japanese leader from F7 to G7. The units under the concealment marker from J7 to J6. Let's move on to the long-awaited close combat phase. In this phase there will be no ambush due to banzai. When the Japanese attack, the encounters are resolved on the line of hand-to-hand combat, with the advantage of -1 for the Japanese. This advantage will be nullified when the other American unit is raided. Units with broken morale cannot attack and have a -2 modifier on the enemy's dice roll. Hex I-6 Americans with 8 firepower and Japanese with 4 firepower. The Americans will have the raider bonus, leader, that will nullify the Japanese hand-to-hand advantage. The Americans will also have the leader's -2 modifier. As there is no ambush, the attack will happen simultaneously in close combat. The Japanese attack will have a ratio of 1 to 2, needing at least 6 or less to affect the Americans hand-to-hand. The American attack will be at a ratio of 2 to 1, with the leader's modifier of -2 needing at least 11 to affect the Japanese. Japanese 3. All American units will be destroyed, but they will be able to carry out an attack against the Japanese. Japanese units are also eliminated in this hex. Hex H5 Japanese attack with 7 firepower against 10 firepower from the Americans, who will not be able to attack because they have broken morale. The Japanese attack will be at a ratio of 1 to 2, with the modifier of 2 due to the Americans' broken morale. A result of 8 or less will be required to affect Americans. With 7, both American squads are eliminated. Hex H4 the Japanese have 4 firepower against the Americans' 5 firepower. The ratio of the Japanese attack will be 1 to 2, with the -1 modifier due to melee, neutralized by the +1 for the attack being against the American raiders. It will take 6 or less to affect Americans. The American attack will be 1 to 1, needing at least 7 to affect the Japanese. The Japanese fail, and the Americans get the result of 7, which will cause the reduction of one of the randomly selected Japanese squadrons. The 2 to 8 medium machine gun operators are chosen and become 1 to 8, and these units go into melee. Hex H3, where there is a Japanese unit under the DN counter, which means that this unit cannot attack, only defend itself with the -2 modifier. The Americans will attack the entirety of the Japanese units at a ratio of 2 to 1, with the modifier of -1 for the Raiders and -2 for the Japanese unit with broken morale, needing 12 or less to affect the Japanese. The 2 Japanese units with 4 firepower will only attack the Paramarines unit, which will defend with 5 firepower, in a ratio of 1 to 2, with the -1 modifier for melee, needing at least 7 to affect the Americans. The first attack will be from the Japanese, who with the result of 3 on the dice, eliminate the Paramarines. The American stack attacks with 8 minus 3 equals 5, and the Japanese units are eliminated. With this, we end the Japanese phase of the third round, and we go to the American phase of this round. Rally phase. There is no action for the Americans, and the Japanese will try to recover squad morale along with the 10-1 leader. Japanese positioned in same hex with a leader do not suffer the deleterious effect of counter DN, receive 1 extra point of morale, and have the modifier of -1 by the Japanese leader. On a 9 on the dice, this unit regains its morale. Prep fire phase. The anti-aircraft gun fires on Japanese units at G5 with A+2 modifier due to the gun being operated by unqualified personnel. As it will use infantry firepower equivalent, IFE, the rate of fire is reduced from 3 to 2. Six plus 2 equals 8, which is a normal morale check, and the cannon loses its rate of fire. Jim makes yet another mistake by not considering the +2 modifier on this shot, and the result ends up being a 1 morale check, and the first squad becomes pink. The second squad passes. The squad with the medium machine gun in these hex fires 8 firepower, with the -2 modifier for the American leader. 3 minus 2 equals 1 than in the 8 firepower column, which results in the elimination of the 2 Japanese units, and the machine gun maintain the rate of fire. A shot with this machine gun is carried out on the G5 hex, where the wounded 8-0 leader is located. 4 firepower -2 by American leader. Six minus 2 equals 4, which is 1 moral check, and the machine gun loses rate of fire. The squad passes the morale check and suffers a new attack from the machine gun with the same modifiers, and again a morale check is obtained, with the machine gun finally losing its rate of fire. The leader is injured. And when we assess the severity of the injury, the result of 4 implies a serious injury. He had already been injured before, culminating in the elimination of the Japanese leader. The unit with the other medium machine gun fires at the Japanese stack with the leader 10-1, with 8 firepower, blast to through the jungle. 5 plus 2 equals 7, which is 1 morale check. Which both Japanese units pass. Movement phase, no actions. Defensive fire phase. Japanese squad on D5 fires on American stack on G3 with 2 firepower, +2 for jungle, -1 for Japanese leader. And it's a miss. Advancing fire phase with no actions. Rout phase, no actions. Advance phase. And at this stage, in a controversial move, the Americans advance their only leader to the H3 hex. Close combat phase, and let's settle the issue of melee units. The Americans attack with 5 firepower to 3 Japanese firepower, in a ratio of 3:2, with Raider modifier -1, needing 9 or less to affect the Japanese. The Japanese will attack 1:2, with a -1 for hand-to-hand, and +1 for attacking the Americans with the Raider skill, requiring a result of 6 or less to affect the Americans. And against all odds, the Japanese eliminate the American squad, ending this 3rd round, and we are off to the rally phase of the 4th round Japanese phase. With that, let's close this episode, where despite suffering intense casualties, the Japanese still advance with good chances of a victory. The move of the sole American leader to the front will likely be regarded as a major tactical error that could result in the Americans' defeat. Hope to see you soon. Namaste. Hello friends, welcome to the final episode of the Kawaguchi's Gamble scenario of the Advanced Squad Leader Starter Kit 4 game. The fight so far has been extremely lethal, with heavy losses on both sides. The Japanese units are dangerously approaching the last defensive strongholds of the Americans, and despite the large number of casualties, they still have the power to deliver one last mortal blow to the Americans and win the scenario. Just to remind you, the Japanese victory conditions imply that there are no American units in good order in level 1. Alternatively, if the Japanese eliminate or take possession of the anti-aircraft gun, they still win if there are one or less American units left on board in the scenario. With that in mind, let's kick off the rally phase of the 4th round's Japanese phase. Rally phase, no actions. Prep fire phase. And the Japanese choose not to direct any shots. Movement phase. Stacking with leader 8 to 0 move, in assault move from H4 to I4. In this, Hex suffers an attack from the American squadron with the machine gun, with 16 firepower for being at close range. +2 modifier for dense jungle, -2 for leader -2. 2 morale check, and the machine gun loses its rate of fire. The leader passes. Japanese leaders are only pinned if they enter a bamboo hex or through a hut collapse. The first group passes but should stay pinned. It is important to remember that the presence of a leader increases the morale of Japanese units by 1 point. The second group breaks and is reduced to the 1 to 7 half squad. A8 firepower residual fire counter is placed on the hex. Stacking in H5 advances to H4 in assault movement, where it suffers a subsequent first fire by the intrinsic firepower of the American squadron in H3. It will be 4 firepower with 0 modifier. One morale check. The first squadron breaks and is flipped to the strike phase. With the result of a double 1, the Japanese squad passes, and Jim is in doubt if the heat of battle applies in this case. The understanding is that in the starter kit there is no heat of battle, and life goes on. Correct interpretation or not? The stack under the concealment marker moves from J6 to I6 using all the movement factors it is entitled to MF for jungle plus to MF for uphill, getting exhausted in the process. Finally, the last guys to move are in the stack with the leader 10-1, which go from D5 to F6. Defensive fire phase. There are no possible shots to be fired, and the Americans choose to change the arc of coverage of the anti-aircraft gun. Let's move on to the advancing fire phase. Medium machine guns fire 8 firepower on the H3 heads, plus 2 modifier for dense jungle. Seven plus 2 equals 9, which in the 8 firepower column is pin test check. Machine guns lose rate of fire. The American units pass. The H4 units fire on H3 with 6 firepower plus modifier 2. And it's a miss. Rout phase. No actions. Advance phase. Units in H3 advance on the hex occupied by American units in H3 entering close combat. F6 to G6. I6 to H5. Close combat phase. Let's resolve the close combat in H3. As this close combat takes place in jungle, we are going to test the ambush possibility. Some modifiers will be in action. Top-tier Japanese are considered stealthy, which grants the -1 modifier to the ambush calculation. As they advanced into the jungle, a modifier of +1 is used. As a result, there will be no modifiers to the Japanese dice result. The Americans are raiders thereafter are stealthy and receive a modifier of -1, also receiving the modifier of -2 for the American leader, with a resultant -3 in the modifiers. The Japanese will use the white die and the Americans the red one. The result of the Japanese is 3 and the result of the Americans is -1, which makes a differential greater than 3, and the Japanese suffer the ambush. With this, the close combat resolution will not happen simultaneously, being sequential, with the Americans shooting first. Americans have 6 firepower against 6 Japanese firepower, with a ratio of 1 to 1. This combat, as it is a Japanese attack, takes place hand to hand, in the red line of the resolution for close combat. As modifiers, the Americans will have -2 for leader and -1 for ambush and -1 for being raiders, needing 11 or less to affect the Japanese. 9 minus 4 equals 5, and the Japanese are summarily eliminated. Rally phase, American phase of the 4th round. No actions. Prep fire phase. The anti-aircraft gun fires using the IFE over the hex with the Japanese leader 10-1. No modifiers. 3, which is a casualty reduction and to morale check. And the cannon maintains the rate of fire. With the random pick, the half squad suffers the reduction of casualty being eliminated. The Japanese leader fails and suffers a wound, with reduced morale and modifier. The leader passes the wound severity test. The Americans decide not to use the cannon for a new shot and use the squad with the medium machine gun. This shot will be 8 firepower. 0 modifiers. Five, and it's to morale checks, and the machine gun maintains the rate of fire. The German leader passes. The Americans launch a renewed attack with 6 firepower and 0 modifiers. And it's a miss. The American squad in H3 fires a 16 firepower round on I-4. 0 modifiers. The result is an casualty reduction followed by a 3 morale check. At random, the leader is injured and passes the severity of the injury. Here Jim misses, and the squads should have become pinned. Movement phase. No movement. Defensive fire phase. I-4 shoots H-3 with 16 firepower, medium machine guns. Plus 2 modifier for dense jungle. Normal morale check and machine guns lose rate of fire. The American leader breaks and goes under the DN counter. The American squad passes. Advancing fire phase. No actions possible. Rout phase. The American leader needs to move as he is in hex adjacent to enemy units in good order. And move to G3. Advance phase. H3 to H2. Close combat phase. No actions. Rally phase of the 5th round Japanese phase. The American leader tries to regain morale and fails. Prep fire phase. No actions. Movement phase. The Japanese resolve to declare a banzai on the American units in Hex G3. Japanese units on H4 lose the concealment counter and make the first push by spending 2 movement factors. The anti-aircraft gun fires with 8 firepower -2 as a modifier. Seven -2 equals 5, which is a 2 morale check, and the cannon maintains rate of fire. And it's a miss. The cannon fires once more with a -2 modifier. One morale check, and the cannon loses its rate of fire. The Japanese leader is wounded again and passes the test of the severity of the wound. Second push H4 to H3 and the leader to G4. The American group on H2 fires 16 firepower with +1 modifier. Nine +2 equals 11, which is a pin test check for which units in Banzai are pin immune. At this moment, Jim makes a mistake again and rolls the dice to check the pin test check, and in both rolls the result is a double 1, and Jim uses the heat of battle rule, and the Japanese are berserk. Fortunately, Jim regains consciousness and takes the berserk counter from the Japanese units ahead. Either way, the initial attack has no effect, and this unit fires one more shot with 4 firepower +2 as a modifier. It's a miss. A new shot is fired on these Japanese units by the squad with the medium machine gun at G3 with 16 firepower and 2 more modifiers. Double 3, and the American unit covers, and the analysis will occur in the 12 firepower column, which will be 1 morale check, and the machine gun loses its rate of fire. The Japanese squads pass by. New momentum and the Japanese stack penetrate the G3 hex. The Japanese leader cannot move because he was injured at some point and retain only 3 movement factors, which have already been depleted, thus ending this banzai charge, remaining in hex G4. American forces now can target Japanese units that have entered their hex. Berserk counters are eliminated as there is no heat of battle in the starter kit. An American squad will attack with subsequent defensive fire, SDF, with the original 6 firepower, halved to 3 by the SDF, and tripled to 9 by the fire originating within the hex itself. The second American squad will attack with a final protective fire, FPF, with the same 9 firepower, only since it is an FPF, the result of the dice roll in this attack will also serve as a normal morale check for this American unit. The attack total will therefore be 16 firepower. Modifiers: +2 for jungle protection, -1 for using non-assault movement. 5 + 1 = 6, which is a 2 morale check. And the American squad that attacked as final protective fire passes the morale check. 8 + 2 = 10, and the first Japanese squad suffers a casualty reduction. 9 + 2 = 11, and the second squad suffers the same fate. In theory, the Americans could carry out a new final protective fire, but they choose not to do so due to the high risk of breaking the morale of these units. At this point, the Japanese units that penetrated the G3 hex could suffer an attack from the American forces in H2 without risk for the American units in that hex, since they are not yet in close combat, which will only happen in the advance phase, but Jim forgets about this possibility. As the movement phase continues, one last move is performed, with the guys on I4 moving to H3. Defensive fire phase. No action. Advancing fire phase. Here Jim makes a mistake and fires 8 firepower from the medium machine guns on the American units in G3. Medium machine guns cannot fire in the advancing fire phase after moving in the movement phase. The modifier will be +2 for the jungle. And, fortunately, it's a miss. Banzai units that penetrated G3 will be able to perform an attack with 6 firepower, halved to 3 firepower for being advancing fire phase, and then tripled to 8 firepower for the shot originating from the hex itself. +2 modifier through the jungle. It's a miss. Rout phase. No actions. Advance phase. H3 to H2 entering close combat. Close combat phase. Starting with hex H2 and let's test the ambush. Modifiers for the Japanese, +1 for leader modifier, +1 for attacking in jungle hex, +1 for attacking American raider units, -1 for the fact that Japanese units are considered stealthy. For Americans, -1 for being stealthy. Americans die red with a result of 0 after applying the modifier. Japanese with the white die 5 after applying modifiers. And we have an ambush on the Japanese units. The attack will be carried out initially by the Americans and will be carried out sequentially, that is, the Japanese will only be able to carry out their attack if they survive the enemy's attack. This close combat will take place with the numbers of the hand-to-hand close combat line, as the Japanese are the attackers. The modifiers are therefore -1 for the Americans being raiders, -1 for being an ambush carried out by the Americans. The ratio will be 5 American firepower to 3 Japanese firepower, with a ratio of 3 to 2, and the Americans need at least 10 or less to affect the Japanese. 8 minus 2 equals 6, and the Japanese are eliminated with no chance to launch their attack. Let's go to Hex G3. Again, we will have one-on-one combat, as the attackers are the Japanese. There is no ambush as the Japanese entered this hex from a banzai charge, and the combat will occur simultaneously. The Japanese will attack with 6 firepower, with the -2 modifiers due to the fact that the leader is broken, -1 for being Japanese in close CPMBAT, +1 for attacking one of the units that is a raider, against 11 firepower of the American units, with a ratio of 1 to 2, needing at least 8 to affect Americans. The Americans will attack with 5 firepower, the leader is broken and cannot attack, with modifiers of -1, raider, with a ratio of 3 to 2, needing at least 9 to affect the Japanese units. Japanese 6 minus 2 equals 4 and American units will be eliminated. Five minus 1 equals 4 and the Japanese are also out. Let's go to the rally phase of the American phase of the 5th round. At this point we will review the victory conditions. The Japanese win at the end of the game if there are no American units in good order in level 1 hexes. In addition, due to the special rule of Scenario 4, the Japanese also win at the end of the game if there is at least one American MMC unit in hex of elevation 1, since the American anti-aircraft gun has been destroyed or captured by the Japanese. Here we have a situation where, if the remaining Japanese leader is allowed to capture the cannon and survive the American onslaught that is sure to follow, the Japanese win. If the Japanese leader is not allowed to capture the cannon, the Americans automatically win. Jim did not find a rule relevant to this case. Not to say that there is no such rule, generally the general guideline is to favor the defenders, which in this case are the Americans. But, in the spirit of sports, Jim will consider the possibility that the Japanese leader can take over the American gun and we will continue the battle. Alright, rally phase of the 5th round American phase. There are no actions just like there aren't in the prep fire phase, and let's go to the movement phase. The Americans advance 1 hex using 2 movement factors and spend 1 movement factor to take control of the cannon after rolling 2 on the dice. Defensive fire, no actions. Advancing fire phase, the American units choose to fire at the Japanese leader using his intrinsic firepower to avoid a possible breakdown of this cannon. Firepower will be 8 firepower, assault fire doubled by point-blank fire. 0 modifier. Eight, which is a normal morale check. Which the Japanese leader passes, as Japanese leaders are not pinned. We go straight to the advance phase of the 6th round, where the Japanese leader advances and enters close combat with the Americans. The possibility of ambush is gauged, the Japanese with modifiers +1 per attack on jungle hex and -1 for the leader being stealthy. Americans with -1 modifier for being stealthy. There is no ambush. The Japanese will attack with 1 firepower to 5 American firepower, a ratio of 1 to 4, -1 for being the Japanese, +1 for attacking a raider unit, and it will take an unlikely 2 on the dice to win the victory. The Americans will attack with 5 firepower to 1, with a ratio of 4 to 1, with -1 modifier for being a raider unit, and with a roll of 12 they will be victorious if the Japanese do not roll a result of 2. And as we expected, the Japanese do not achieve the desired result, and the Americans are immediately considered victorious, as they maintained the integrity of the cannon and have a unit in good order in hex with elevation of 1. Well done, friends. With that, Jim ends this exciting battle, and we prepare for the next scenario of Starter Kit 4, probably the American Devil, S-71, where one of the rare situations where American armored units clashed with Japanese armored units is presented. Hope to see you soon. Namaste.